Alright, welcome back to Mr. Berry Lectures. This is Chapter 16, World War II, Section 1, Hitler's Lightning War. This lecture was originally given on May 12th, 2015. Alright, here we go. So, main idea for today's notes is empire building. So, using sudden mass attack, called Blitzkrieg, which actually is one of your vocab terms, and we'll get to that in a second, Germany overran much of Europe and northern Africa. Now, why does this matter today? Why are we looking at this? Well, Hitler's actions set off World War II, and the results of this war still affect the politics and economies of today's world. Setting the stage. So, during the 1930s, Hitler had played on the hopes and fears of the Western democracies. Each time the Nazi dictator grabbed new territory, he would declare an end to his demands. Peace seemed guaranteed, until, that is, again, Hitler moved again. After his moves into the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, Hitler is now going to turn his eyes to Poland. After World War I, the Allies had cut out the Polish corridor from German territory to give Poland access to the sea. In 1939, Hitler demanded that the Polish corridor be returned to Germany. Germany sparks a new war in Europe. At this point, you'll recall from Chapter 15, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin had signed what is called a non-aggression pact with Hitler. This pact was supposed to last for 10 years. After being excluded from the Munich conference, Stalin was not eager to join with the West. Also, Hitler had promised him new territory. In a secret part of the pact, this non-aggression pact was generally very public, so people kind of knew about it, but in a secret portion of the pact, Germany and the Soviet Union had agreed to divide Poland between them when one of them took it over. They also agreed that the USSR could take over Finland and the Baltic countries of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Now, non-aggression pact is one of your vocab terms. It is an agreement in which nations promise not to attack one another, but in this case we're talking specifically about Russia and Germany. Speaking of vocab terms, here's another one. Germany's lightning attack. After signing this non-aggression pact, Hitler quickly moved ahead with plans to conquer Poland. His surprise attack took place on dawn of September 1st, 1939. German tanks and troops rumbled across the Polish border, and at the same time German aircraft and artillery began a merciless bombing of Poland's capital, Warsaw. France and Great Britain declared war on Germany on September 3rd, but Poland had fallen some time before those nations could take any military response, so this was a little late on their part. At this point, after his victory, Hitler annexed the western half of Poland. That region had a large German population. The German invasion of Poland was kind of the first test of Germany's new military strategy, something called Blitzkrieg, or literally lightning war if you translate it from the German. It involves using fast-moving airplanes and tanks followed by massive infantry forces to take an enemy defenders by surprise and quickly overwhelm them. In the case of Poland, this strategy worked rather well. Okay? And that is basically your vocab term up there, okay? Alright. So, Blitzkrieg is going to be used other places other than Poland, however, and we're going to see those in a little bit. Now let's look then, before this, however, at the Soviets making their move. On September 17th, Stalin sent Soviet troops to occupy the eastern half of Poland. Again, in their agreement, Germany and Russia are going to divide this. Stalin then moves to annex the countries of north of Poland, which they had also been promised in this agreement. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, generally speaking, fell without a struggle, but Finland did resist. In November, Stalin sent nearly 1 million Soviet troops into Finland. The Soviets expected a quick victory, and so they were not prepared for winter fighting. They actually didn't expect to be there very long. Unfortunately, this was a crucial mistake. The Finns were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fiercely defended their country. In the freezing winter weather, soldiers on skis swiftly attacked Soviet positions, and in contrast, the Soviets struggled to make progress through the deep snow, which is actually kind of remarkable considering we're talking about Russians. The Soviets suffered heavy losses, but they finally won through sheer force of numbers, as tends to be the predominant strategy for the Russians. They have the largest military on the planet at this point, and so overwhelming anyone really isn't that hard for them. They just have to throw more people at it until the problem kind of solves itself. By March 1940, Stalin had forced the Finns to accept his surrender, just by that strategy. And the second thing we talk about here is called the Phony War. Now, after they declared war on Germany, the French and British had mobilized their armies. They stationed their troops along what is called the Maginot Line, which is a system of fortifications along France's border with Germany. Now, they'd built these in the 30s, so those didn't really exist during the First World War, but they knew that if they ever had to go to war with them, they might need to use these, so they had built those. Now, there they waited for the Germans to attack. However, nothing ever happened. This attack didn't come. Okay? With very little to do, the bored Allied soldiers stared eastward towards the enemy. Equally bored, the German soldiers stared back from their Siegfried Line, which is very similar to the Maginot Line, except that it's German, a few miles away. Germans jokingly called this particular period of time Sitzkrieg, or a sitting war. Some newspapers actually referred to it simply as the Phony War, which is where we get the term here. Suddenly, however, on April 9th, 1940, the calm ended. Hitler launched a surprise invasion of Denmark and Norway, nowhere near France. In just 4 hours after the attack, Denmark falls, and 2 months later, Norway surrenders as well. The Germans then began to build bases along the Norwegian and Danish coasts from which they could launch strikes on Great Britain, which they will do a little later. Attacking France and the rescue at Dunkirk. So, in May 1940, Hitler began a dramatic sweep through the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. This is kind of part of his strategy to strike at France, and keeping the Allies' attention on those countries, Hitler then sent an even larger force of tanks and troops to slice through the Ardennes. This was a heavily wooded area in northern France, Luxembourg, and Belgium, and moving through the Ardennes, he was moving through the forest, and the Germans kind of squeezed between the Maginot Line, okay, this line of defenses in France. From there, they moved across France and reached the country's northern coast in about 10 days. Okay, then we'll talk about the rescue of Dunkirk. So, after reaching the French coast, the Germans' forces swung north again and joined the German troops in Belgium. By the end of May 1940, the Germans had trapped the Allied forces around the northern French city of Lille. Outnumbered and outgunned, and pounded from the air by the German Air Force, the Allies retreated to the beach of Dunkirk, a French port city near the Belgian border. They were trapped with their backs to the sea. Now, in one of the most heroic acts of the war, Great Britain set out to rescue the army. It sent a fleet of about 850 ships across the English Channel to Dunkirk. After the Royal Navy, along with the Royal Navy ships, civilian craft, yachts, lifeboats, motorboats, paddle steamers, and fishing boats, and so on, joined the rescue effort. From May 26th to June 4th, this amateur armada, along with the Navy, of course, under heavy fire from German bombers, sailed back and forth from Britain to Dunkirk. These boats carried some 338,000 battle-weary soldiers to safety. Now, this is considered, of course, a great loss for the Allies because they're now going to have a lot fewer people defending France. The fall of France and Charles de Gaulle. We need to talk about both of these things. So following Dunkirk, resistance in France began to crumble. By June 14th, the Germans had taken Paris, and accepting the inevitable, French leaders surrendered on June 22nd, 1940. So France fell really, really quickly. The Germans took control of the northern part of the country, and they left the southern part to a puppet government headed by Marshal Pétain, Philippe Pétain, a French hero from World War I. The headquarters of this government, the southern portion of France, was in the city of Vichy, so it's actually called Vichy, France. After the France fell, Charles de Gaulle, a French general, set up a government in exile in London. He committed all of his energy to reconquering France. In radio broadcasts from England, de Gaulle actually called on the people of France to join him in resisting the Germans, saying, quote, "It is the obligation and duty of all Frenchmen who still bear arms to continue the struggle, for them to lay down their arms to evacuate any position of military importance, or agree to hand over any part of the French territory, however small, to the enemy. Control would be a crime against our country." He says, now de Gaulle went on to organize the Free French military forces and battled the Nazis until France was liberated by the Americans and the British in 1944. So he is going to try to help out. Now, Charles de Gaulle is also one of your vocab terms here. He is a top French general and resistance leader during World War II. He also eventually becomes the president of France between 1959 and 69 when they're looking for some leadership then. By the way, these two pictures on the bottom, sad French citizens during the invasion of Paris, and then also thousands of German troops during the invasion of the same city. With the fall of France, Great Britain really stood alone against the Nazis. They were the last major Western democracy that was still currently in the fight at this time. Winston Churchill, the new British Prime Minister, had already declared that his nation would never give in. In a rousing speech, he proclaimed, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender," he says. Hitler now turned his mind to the invasion of Great Britain, and his plans was first to knock out the Royal Air Force and then to land more than 250,000 soldiers on England's shores, again something Winston Churchill pledged to not let happen. Winston Churchill is one of your vocab terms up here. He's the British Prime Minister from 1940 to 45, and also 1951 to 55. There's a segment of time in there where he's out of power, but he serves two different terms. He led Britain through the Second World War and pledged, as we see here, that his nation would never give in to Hitler. It is probable, by the way, that Winston Churchill is maybe Britain's most powerful weapon that the British had against the Nazis. As they stood alone against Hitler's Germany, Winston Churchill boasted that the British would never give in. Although Churchill had a speech defect as a youngster, he actually grows to become one of the greatest orators or speakers of all time. He used all his gifts as a speaker to rally the people behind the effort to crush Germany. In another famous speech, he promised that Britain would wage war by sea, by land, and by air with all of our might and with all the strength that God can give us against a monstrous tyranny. Obviously that being Nazis. Okay. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe, otherwise known as Germany's Air Force, began bombing Great Britain. At first, the Germans targeted the British airfields and aircraft factories. Then, on September 7, 1940, they began focusing on the cities, especially London, to break British morale. They wanted to make people not want to fight. Now, despite the destruction and loss of life, the British did not waver. The RAF, although badly outnumbered, began to hit back hard. Okay. Two technological devices also helped turn the tide of the RAF's in the RAF's favor. One was an electronic tracking system known as radar. Developed in the 1930s, radar could tell basically the number, speed, and direction of the incoming planes. And if you're not really familiar, the idea of radar is you kind of send out a signal, it bounces off whatever you hit it with, and it returns it to the device, and you can kind of tell where stuff is. In this particular case, we're bouncing it off airplanes, and we can tell how many there are and how fast they're moving, in what direction, etc. Okay. The other device that was helpful to the RAF was a German code-making machine named the Enigma. A complete Enigma machine had been smuggled into Great Britain in the late 1930s, and Enigma enabled the British to decode German secret messages. With information gathered from these devices, RAF flyers could quickly launch attacks on enemies, knowing exactly when and where and how many there would be. So that was actually very helpful. I'm going to show you, of course, some pictures from the Battle of Britain. These are, of course, squadrons of German bombers. Air raids were extremely common in Britain at this time, and the Germans committed a great deal of aircraft to this operation in Britain. Of course, because of this, destruction was very heavy in Britain. A lot of buildings were completely destroyed, of course, where people lived, office buildings, sometimes even churches, places of worship. Buses were thrown hitherto and about and into buildings. And frequently the only safe place for people to live was actually in the underground or the subways of London. So this one down in the bottom right, you see people are living down there during an air raid. They're sleeping in this case, but It was the only safe place to be because you were, several tens of 20s of feet underground, so you're not going to be killed there probably, or at least not as easily. Now, to avoid the RAF's attacks, the Germans gave up daylight raids in October of 1940 in favor of night bombings. At sunset, the wail of sirens filled the air as Londoners flocked to the subways, which we just saw, which served as an air raid shelters. Some rode out the bombing raids at home in smaller air raid shelters or basements, and this Battle of Britain continued until May 10, 1941. Stunned by the British resistance, Hitler decided to call off his attacks. Instead, he decided to focus on the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, and the Battle of Britain taught the Allies a crucial lesson, that Hitler's attacks could be blocked, if only you would give enough force to block them. Now, the Battle of Britain is one of your vocab terms here. It is a series of battles between German and British air forces fought over Britain between 1940 and 41. Alright, now let's look at the Mediterranean and Eastern Front. The stubborn resistance of the British in the Battle of Britain caused a shift in Hitler's strategy in Europe. He decided to deal with Great Britain a little later. He then turned his attention east to the Mediterranean area and the Balkans, and to the ultimate prize, the Soviet Union. If you'll remember, we talked about Mein Kampf earlier. He decided that he was going to try to take this area over eventually. So, one of the things that he's going to attempt to do is get some land in order to go over there, and we'll kind of see that in a little while. However, before we get to that, we need to talk about the Axis forces attacking North Africa. So, Germany's first objective in the Mediterranean was the region of North Africa, and mainly because Hitler's partner Mussolini. Despite its alliance with Germany, Italy had actually remained neutral at the beginning of the war. And with Hitler's conquest of France, however, Mussolini knew he had to take action. Okay? After declaring war on France and Great Britain, Mussolini actually moved into France. So they're a little late to the game, but go figure. Mussolini took his next step in North Africa in September 1940, and while the Battle of Britain was raging, he ordered his army to attack British-controlled Egypt. Now, why Egypt? Well, Egypt's Suez Canal was key to reaching the oil fields of the Middle East. Also, if the Italians could get control of the Suez Canal, they would cut off any oil shipments to Britain or any of its allies. Okay, within a week of getting there, the Italian troops had pushed 60 miles inside Egypt, forcing British units back. Then both sides dug in and waited. Okay, now. Finally, in December, the British struck back. The result was a disaster for the Italians, and by February 1941, the British had swept 500 miles across North Africa and taken 130,000 Italian prisoners. Hitler had to step in to save his Axis partner, because he obviously doesn't want to be alone here. And to reinforce the Italians, Hitler sent a crack German tank force called the Afrika Korps, under the command of a general, we see here, Erwin Rommel. Now, in late March 1941, Rommel's Afrika Korps attacked. Caught by surprise, the British forces retreated to Tobruk, Libya, which is next to Egypt. And after fierce fighting for Tobruk, the British began to drive Rommel back. Now, by mid-January 1942, however, Rommel had retreated to where he had started. In June of 1942, the tide of battle turned again, and Rommel regrouped, pushing the British back across the desert and seized Tobruk again, a shattering loss for the Allies. Rommel's success in North Africa earned him the nickname the Desert Fox, or in German, the Wüstenfuchs. But honestly, it sounds better in English, so we'll just go with Desert Fox. Okay. So, Erwin Rommel is also one of your vocab terms. He's up here. He's the German field marshal and commander of the 7th German Tank Division during World War II. He earned the respect of fighters on both sides for his immense skill in commanding tanks. War in the Balkans. So, while Rommel campaigned in North Africa, other German generals were active in the Balkans. Hitler had begun planning an attack on his ally, the USSR, which again we have seen in Mein Kampf, as early as summer of 1940. Now, the Balkan countries of southeastern Europe were key to Hitler's invasion plan. Hitler wanted to build bases in southeastern Europe for the attack on the Soviet Union. He also wanted to make sure that the British did not interfere, and so if he can take these areas out, that just gives him more places to do this. Now, to prepare for his invasion, Hitler moves to expand his influences in the Balkans. By early 1941, through threat of force, he had persuaded Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary to join the Axis powers. Yugoslavia and Greece, however, which had pro-British governments, resisted. In early 1941, Hitler invaded both of these countries, Yugoslavia falling in 11 days, and Greece surrendering in 17, so they all fall under 20 days. In Athens, the Nazis celebrated their victory by raising swastikas at the Acropolis, if you can believe that. So, again, not a fun time for Balkan countries either. Now, Hitler invades the Soviet Union. Once he's done with this invasion of the Balkans, Hitler could move ahead with Operation Barbarossa. Barbarossa is his plan to invade the Soviet Union. Now, early in the morning of June 22, 1941, the roar of German tanks and aircraft announced the beginning of the invasion. The Soviet Union, of course, was not prepared for this attack, given that they had a non-aggression pact with each other, and although it had the largest army in the world, its troops were neither well-equipped nor well-trained. The invasion rolled on week after week until the Germans had pushed 500 miles into the Soviet Union. As the Soviet troops retreated, they burned and destroyed everything in the enemy's path, and the Russians had used the scorched earth, using something called the scorched earth strategy that they'd also used against Napoleon. It prevents, of course, the Germans from using any resources that might have been there. Now, on September 8th, the Germans put Leningrad under siege. Okay? By early November, the city was completely cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. Nothing went in and nothing went out. And to force a surrender, Hitler was ready to starve the city's more than 2.5 million inhabitants. German bombs destroyed warehouses where food was stored, and desperately hungry, these people began eating cattle and horse feed, as well as cats and dogs, and finally crows and rats. So really, food was running out quite quickly there. Nearly 1 million people died in Leningrad during the winter of 1941 to 42, and though this happened, the city refused to fall. Now, impatient with the progress in Leningrad, Hitler looked to Moscow, the capital and heart of the Soviet Union. A Nazi drive on the capital began on October 2, 1941. By December, the Germans had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow, and Soviet General Georgy Zhukov counterattacked. As temperatures fell, the Germans in their summer uniforms, which by the way is what they had, ended up needing to retreat. Ignoring Napoleon's winter defeat 130 years before, which again was something that Hitler should have learned for, he sent his generals a stunning order. He said, "No retreat." German troops dug in about 125 miles west of Moscow, and they held the line against the Soviets until March 1943. Hitler's advance on the Soviet Union gained nothing but cost the Germans some 500,000 lives, which obviously we know it cost the Russians more, but again, that falls in line with their strategy of throw people at the problem until it becomes not a problem. Alright, let's talk about the United States for a little bit. Again, not an American history class, but it bears mentioning. So, the United States aids its allies. So, most Americans felt that the United States should not get involved in the war. Again, we're an isolationist country, and between 1935 and 1937, Congress had actually passed a series of neutrality acts which made it illegal for us to sell arms or lend money to nations at war. However, our President FDR, President Roosevelt, knew that if the Allies fell, the United States would be drawn into the war anyway. So in September 1939, he asked Congress to allow the Allies to buy American arms. The Allies would pay cash and then carry their goods on their own ships, so we had some plausible amount of deniability here. Under the Lend-Lease Act, as it was called, passed in March 1941, the President could lend or lease arms and other supplies to a country vital to the United States. If we needed them to survive, obviously we could sell stuff to them. By the summer of 1941, the U.S. Navy was escorting British troops and ships carrying U.S. arms. In response, Hitler ordered his submarines to sink any cargo ships that they met. Though the U.S. had not entered the war at this point, Roosevelt and Churchill met secretly and issued a joint declaration called the Atlantic Charter. Okay? It upheld free trade among nations and rights of people to choose their own government. The Charter later would serve as the Allies' peace plan at the end of the Second World War, or at least the basis for it anyway. Now, on September 4th, again, remember the Germans, Hitler has ordered German U-boats to start sinking any of these shipments coming to Britain. Now, U-boats fire upon a U.S. destroyer in the Atlantic. Now, to be clear, this destroyer doesn't have any supplies on it. It's just going with a British ship. But in response to this, Roosevelt actually orders Navy commanders to shoot German submarines on sight. The United States now technically is involved in an undeclared naval war with Hitler. To almost everyone's surprise, however, the attack that actually drew the United States into the war did not come from Germany, it would come from Japan, which we'll see in Section 2. Now, before we do that, again, your Atlantic Charter is one of your vocab terms, a declaration of principles issued by Churchill and FDR on which the Allied peace plan at the end of the Second World War would be based. All right, see you in Section 3. Be good.